Blake Harrison leaned against the towering glass windows of his penthouse, the city of Manhattan glittering beneath him like a sea of diamonds. The party behind him was a cacophony of laughter, clinking champagne flutes, and shallow conversations. Another networking event, another opportunity to bolster his already gilded empire. Yet, Blake felt hollow. "Mr. Harrison, the mayor would like a word," his assistant Evelyn said, her clipboard tucked neatly under one arm. Blake nodded absently, pushing himself away from the view. "Tell him I'll be there in a moment." As Evelyn disappeared into the throng, Blake slipped out of the party unnoticed. He took the elevator down, his reflection in the mirrored walls staring back at him, an image of perfect wealth and success. But beneath the polished exterior was a man suffocated by monotony. Outside, the November air bit at his skin as he walked aimlessly down the bustling street. It wasn't long before the golden arches of a McDonald's caught his eye. Blake smirked. The idea of ducking into a fast food joint, dressed in a tailored Armani suit, amused him. He stepped inside. The restaurant buzzed with the chatter of families and the hum of fryers. Blake stood out like a sore thumb, but no one seemed to care. As he waited in line, he noticed her, a woman in her late 20s with auburn hair pulled back into a practical ponytail. Her uniform was plain, but her warm smile and easy demeanor lit up the room. Next in line, she called out, her voice carrying a kindness that seemed out of place in the chaos. Blake stepped forward. "Just a coffee." "Please." Black. Her name tag read Rachel. "Coming right up," she said, her smile not faltering as she turned to prepare his order. Behind her, a colleague spilled a tray of fries, eliciting groans from customers. Rachel didn't lose her cool. "Don't sweat it, Manny," she said to the flustered teenager. "Happens to the best of us." Blake watched, intrigued. There was a calm resilience about her, a sincerity he hadn't seen in years. When she returned with his coffee, she caught him staring. "Anything else?" she asked, tilting her head. Blake cleared his throat. "No, this is perfect. Thank you." As he sat in the corner sipping his coffee, Blake found himself drawn to Rachel's interactions. She treated every customer the same, whether they were a hurried businessman or a child with sticky hands. Her laughter rang out, genuine and warm, cutting through the cold November night. Blake left the McDonald's that evening feeling something unfamiliar, a spark of curiosity, a faint crack in the armor of his discontent. Blake Harrison's routine had always been a finely tuned machine. Mornings were for strategic meetings, afternoons dedicated to power lunches with investors, and evenings spent mingling with high society. Yet the following week, his carefully structured days began to shift in a way that startled even him. He found himself slipping out of his office during lunch hours or dodging invitations to exclusive events. Instead, he would head to the unassuming McDonald's tucked between a laundromat and a nail salon. At first, he told himself it was for the coffee, a simple indulgence that stood in stark contrast to the artisanal blends his assistant brewed back at the office. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about the coffee. It was Rachel. By his fourth visit, Blake felt ridiculous. What was he doing lurking in a fast food restaurant? Still, he couldn't ignore the pull. Rachel's presence fascinated him. She was unlike anyone he'd encountered in his world of corporate sharks and social climbers. Her simplicity wasn't a lack of ambition. It was a quiet strength. She moved with purpose, her kindness undeterred by rude customers or long shifts. On a crisp Wednesday afternoon, Blake finally gathered the courage to speak to her. He approached the counter, loosening his tie as if that might make him less conspicuous. "Back again," Rachel teased as she rang up his usual black coffee. Her eyes twinkled with amusement. Blake chuckled, feeling uncharacteristically self-conscious. "Guilty. I think I'm starting to prefer your coffee over the overpriced stuff at my office." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "Either we're doing something right, or your office coffee is terrible." "It's fine," Blake said, laughing, "but it doesn't come with your service." Rachel rolled her eyes playfully. "Flattery won't get you extra creamers, you know." Blake smiled, but his tone softened. "I'm serious, though. You're good at what you do. Most people would have lost it when that guy last week yelled about his cold fries. Rachel shrugged, her demeanor modest. It's just part of the job. People have bad days. Sometimes you just have to take it on the chin and keep moving. Blake leaned against the counter, intrigued. And you keep moving. How do you do that? Rachel hesitated, caught off guard by his sincerity. She glanced over her shoulder to ensure the line wasn't backing up, then turned her attention back to him. Well, she began, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. You can't control the cards life deals you, but you can control how you play them. I've got a little girl who depends on me. Giving up isn't an option. Blake's gaze softened. A little girl. Chloe, Rachel said, her face lighting up at the mention of her daughter. She's 6, smart as a whip, and way too good at convincing me to let her stay up late. Blake chuckled. Sounds like she keeps you on your toes. Oh, she does, Rachel replied with a grin. But she's my world. Everything I do is for her. Their conversation was cut short when another customer stepped up to the counter, and Rachel excused herself with an apologetic smile. Blake returned to his corner booth, but he couldn't stop thinking about her words. They lingered in his mind, each one a glimpse into a life so far removed from his own. As he watched Rachel work, he noticed things he hadn't before. The way she seemed to know the names of regulars, asking an elderly man how his wife's surgery had gone, or reminding a teenager to grab his textbook before leaving. She wasn't just working, she was connecting, leaving a piece of herself with every interaction. By the time Blake left that day, the gears in his mind were turning. He wanted to know more about Rachel, not just the surface details, but the life behind the radiant smile and steady resilience. The next time Blake entered the McDonald's, it was with a determined air. He had rehearsed the scenario in his mind a dozen times, but the nerves gnawing at him told a different story. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a casual shirt, he hoped to blend in better with the crowd, though his polished shoes and unmistakable aura of wealth still made him stand out. Rachel was at the register again, her ponytail swinging as she turned to fill a drink order. Blake took his usual spot in line, watching her greet each customer with the same genuine warmth. As his turn approached, his heart picked up speed, an unfamiliar sensation for a man accustomed to boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations. Black coffee, right? Rachel asked with a smile when she saw him. Caught me, Blake said, grinning. I might be addicted at this point. Rachel laughed softly, ringing up his order. Well, at least it's a cheap habit. That'll be $1.39. Blake handed her a $5 bill, waving off the change. He lingered at the counter as she prepared his coffee, gathering the courage to say what he'd come to say. Hey, Rachel, he began, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. She glanced up, curious. Yeah, I was wondering if you'd have dinner with me sometime, Blake said, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. Rachel froze, the coffee pot halfway to the cup. Her smile faltered for the first time since he'd met her, replaced by a mixture of surprise and suspicion. She set the pot down and folded her arms, leaning slightly against the counter. You're asking me to dinner, she repeated, her tone cautious. Blake nodded. Yes. I'd really like to get to know you better. Rachel studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to decipher his motives. Look, I appreciate the offer, but she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at the growing line of customers. Why me? You're clearly not from around here. Blake scratched the back of his neck, searching for the right words. You're right, I'm not. But that's exactly why I'm interested. You're different from anyone I've ever met. You're real. And honestly, I could use more of that in my life. Rachel raised an eyebrow, her skepticism still evident. Real, huh? And what exactly does real mean to someone like you? Blake met her gaze, his expression earnest. It means someone who doesn't hide behind a facade. Someone who treats people with respect, no matter who they are. Someone who makes me want to be better. The line behind him was starting to shift impatiently, but neither of them seemed to notice. Rachel bit her lip, her defenses wavering. She wanted to believe him, but the little voice in her head warned her to tread carefully. "Look," she said finally, her tone firm, but not unkind. "I've got a daughter at home and a million things on my plate. I don't have time for games, Mr. Harrison," Blake supplied. Blake Harrison. Rachel's eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. Blake Harrison, as in the guy whose name is on half the buildings in Midtown. Blake winced. "That would be me." Rachel shook her head, a rueful smile playing on her lips. "And you're sitting here in a McDonald's asking a single mom to dinner? Why?" "Because," Blake said, leaning forward slightly, "I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who only care about what they can get from me. You're the first person who's looked at me like I'm just Blake. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, just a guy who likes your coffee." Rachel stared at him, her resolve softening. There was something disarming about his honesty, something that made her want to believe he wasn't like the others who had come and gone, leaving only disappointment in their wake. "Okay," she said at last, her voice quiet but resolute. "One dinner, but on my terms." Blake's face lit up with a boyish grin that made him look years younger. "Name them." "No fancy restaurants," Rachel said, holding up a finger. "If I'm going to do this, it's going to be somewhere I'm comfortable." "Done," Blake said without hesitation. "And no assumptions," she added. "I'm agreeing to dinner, not anything else." "Understood," Blake said, his tone serious. "I'll pick you up Saturday at 7. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but don't be late. I have to arrange a sitter." "I wouldn't dream of it," Blake said, stepping aside to let the next customer order. As Rachel returned to work, her mind raced. She couldn't believe she'd agreed to dinner with someone like Blake Harrison. Part of her felt reckless, but another part, the part that had seen the sincerity in his eyes, felt curious. Blake, meanwhile, left the restaurant feeling a mixture of relief and exhilaration. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with business or success. That night, Rachel tucked Chloe into bed, her daughter's sleepy voice asking, "Mommy, are you happy?" The question caught Rachel off guard. She smoothed Chloe's hair and kissed her forehead. "I am, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" Chloe yawned, her eyes fluttering closed. "You smiled a lot today." Rachel's heart softened. She sat beside her daughter until she fell asleep, the weight of the day pressing against her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Blake spent the evening planning, calling Evelyn to arrange for a private but modest venue where Rachel would feel at ease. He wanted everything to be perfect, not extravagant, but thoughtful. As Saturday approached, both Rachel and Blake found themselves navigating a mix of excitement and apprehension. Two people from different worlds, brought together by chance, were about to take the first step towards something that neither of them fully understood. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp chill in the air, the kind that hinted at the first whispers of winter. Rachel stood in front of her small bathroom mirror, frowning at her reflection. She had opted for a simple navy blue dress that hugged her frame without being too revealing, paired with a cardigan to ward off the cold. Her hair was pinned up loosely, with a few strands framing her face. Chloe sat cross-legged on the bed, watching her mother intently. "You look like a princess, Mommy," Chloe said with a grin, holding her stuffed bunny close. Rachel turned to her daughter, her heart softening. "Thanks, sweetheart. Be good for Mrs. Wilson, okay? I'll be back before you know it." Chloe nodded solemnly, though her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Is your friend nice?" Rachel hesitated. "I think so. But tonight is just dinner, nothing more." A honk from outside interrupted their conversation. Rachel peeked through the window and saw a sleek, black car idling by the curb. She sighed. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was still a far cry from her world. Mrs. Wilson, their elderly neighbor, arrived promptly and shooed Rachel out the door with a reassuring smile. "Go on, dear. Chloe and I will have a grand time. Don't worry about a thing." As Rachel approached the car, Blake stepped out to greet her, his breath visible in the cold air. He was dressed more casually than she had expected, dark jeans and a tailored coat, but still exuded an effortless confidence. "You look beautiful," Blake said, his smile genuine. "Thanks," Rachel replied, trying to suppress the nerves fluttering in her stomach. "You're on time. I wouldn't dare be late," he said, opening the car door for her. The drive was short but quiet, the weight of their different worlds palpable in the confined space. Blake stole a glance at Rachel, who stared out the window, her expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "Yeah," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just not used to this." "This?" She gestured vaguely at the car's leather interior. "The whole being chauffeured to dinner thing. It's a little surreal." Blake nodded, understanding. "I get it. But tonight isn't about any of that. I just want to spend time with you." Rachel glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She offered a small smile, her tension easing slightly. When they arrived, Rachel was relieved to see that the restaurant wasn't one of the high-end establishments she had dreaded. Instead, it was a cozy Italian bistro tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The warm glow of string lights wrapped around the entrance gave it an inviting charm. "This is nice," Rachel admitted as they stepped inside. "I thought you'd like it," Blake said. "No Michelin stars, but the lasagna is unbeatable." The hostess led them to a corner table by the window, where soft jazz played in the background. Rachel took a moment to absorb her surroundings, the rich aroma of garlic and fresh bread wafting through the air. For a brief moment, she felt at ease. As they settled in, the waiter poured water and handed them menus. Blake noticed Rachel scanning the prices, her brow furrowing slightly. "Don't worry about that," Blake said gently. "Tonight's on me." Rachel set the menu down and folded her hands. "It's not about that. I don't belong in places like this." Blake leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Rachel, you belong anywhere you want to be. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise." His words caught her off guard, and she found herself relaxing despite her initial discomfort. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" "I try," Blake said with a small grin. Their conversation flowed more easily as the evening went on. Rachel talked about Chloe, how she loved drawing animals, how she wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. Blake listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that made Rachel feel like he genuinely cared. When the food arrived, Rachel couldn't help but laugh. "You weren't kidding about the lasagna. This plate is massive." Blake chuckled. "I told you, they don't mess around here." As they ate, Blake opened up about his life. He shared stories about his rise to success, though he glossed over the less glamorous parts. Rachel noticed the way his tone shifted when he talked about his work, a mix of pride and weariness. "You don't sound very happy about it," she said, setting her fork down. Blake hesitated, caught off guard by her observation. "I guess I'm not," he admitted. "It's strange, isn't it? You spend your whole life chasing something, thinking it'll make you happy, and when you finally get there, it's not what you thought it would be." Rachel studied him, her expression thoughtful. "So why keep doing it?" Blake leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "Because I don't know how to stop. It's all I've ever known." The honesty in his voice struck a chord with Rachel. For the first time, she saw beyond the polished exterior to the man underneath, a man who was just as lost in his own way as she had been at her lowest. By the time dessert arrived, the initial awkwardness between them had melted away. Rachel found herself laughing at Blake's dry humor, and Blake was captivated by the way her eyes lit up when she talked about the small joys in her life. As they left the restaurant, Blake walked Rachel to the car, the crisp night air wrapping around them. He hesitated before opening the door, turning to face her instead. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "It meant a lot to me." Rachel looked up at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "I should be thanking you. I haven't had a night like this in, I don't even remember how long." Blake smiled, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Maybe we can do it again sometime." Rachel hesitated, her practical side warning her to be cautious. But another part of her, the part that had felt alive for the first time in years, nodded. "Maybe," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. The next few weeks passed in a strange, almost surreal rhythm for Rachel. Blake Harrison, billionaire CEO, a name that had once seemed untouchable, had become a recurring presence in her life. It started subtly. He would drop by the McDonald's during her shifts, always ordering the same black coffee and lingering just long enough for a quick conversation. At first, Rachel was wary, but as the days went on, she found herself looking forward to his visits. Blake, for his part, was relentless in his quiet determination. He didn't push or demand her attention. He simply showed up, weaving himself into the fabric of her routine in a way that felt natural. He learned the names of her coworkers, even exchanging jokes with Manny, the nervous teenager who was slowly mastering the fryer. He asked Rachel how Chloe was doing, always attentive to the smallest details. One afternoon, during a rare lull in the restaurant, Rachel leaned against the counter, watching Blake stir his coffee. "You're here a lot," she said, her tone teasing but curious. Blake looked up, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. "Guilty. I've had a pretty good excuse, though. And what's that?" "You," he said simply, his voice sincere. Rachel rolled her eyes, though she couldn't suppress the smile tugging at her lips. "You're lucky I don't charge you rent for that booth," she said, nodding toward his usual spot in the corner. Blake chuckled. "Fair enough. But honestly, Rachel, I just enjoy being here. It's refreshing. You're refreshing." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking in before Rachel could respond. She felt a warmth rise in her chest, a mixture of flattery and unease. She had spent years building walls, protecting herself from disappointment and heartbreak. Blake's attention felt too good to be true. That evening, as Rachel walked home, her thoughts were consumed by Blake. She couldn't deny the way her heart lifted when he was around, but the voice of caution still whispered in the back of her mind. She glanced at the apartment building as she approached, the familiar sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting grounding her in reality. "Mommy." Chloe's voice called from the window, her face lighting up as Rachel waved. Inside, Chloe bounced on the couch, her excitement bubbling over. "Guess what?" she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "What?" Rachel asked, setting her bag down. "A man came by. He had a bag, and he said it was for us." Chloe pointed to the kitchen table, where a neatly wrapped package sat. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she approached the package. Tied with a simple ribbon, it bore a handwritten note. "Thought Chloe might like this." No strings attached, just a small gesture. Rachel opened the package carefully, revealing a set of art supplies, crayons, sketchbooks, and watercolor paints. Chloe squealed with delight, immediately grabbing the crayons and flipping open a blank page. "Mommy, look, I can draw animals now," Chloe exclaimed, already scribbling furiously. Rachel stared at the gift, her emotions a tangle of gratitude and wariness. She couldn't remember the last time someone had done something so thoughtful for her or Chloe. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that accepting such kindness might come with unseen consequences. The next day, Blake arrived at the McDonald's as usual, but Rachel pulled him aside before he could even order. "What's this?" she asked, holding up the note. Blake smiled, his expression calm. "It's a gift. For Chloe. She mentioned she liked to draw, and I thought she might enjoy it." "Blake," Rachel said, her voice firm but not unkind, "I appreciate the gesture, but you don't have to do this. I don't want Chloe getting attached to something that might not last." Blake's smile faded, replaced by an earnestness that caught Rachel off guard. "I'm not doing this to impress you, Rachel. I'm doing it because I care. About you and about Chloe. I don't expect anything in return." Rachel looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of insincerity. She found none. With a sigh, she nodded. "But no more surprises, deal." "Deal," Blake said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Over the following weeks, Blake's efforts to connect with Chloe became more deliberate. He didn't shower her with extravagant gifts or overstep his boundaries. Instead, he brought small tokens that showed he had been listening. an animal-themed puzzle, a book about dinosaurs, a packet of stickers featuring her favorite cartoon characters. Rachel watched with growing amazement as Chloe warmed to Blake. She was cautious at first, but Blake's gentle persistence won her over. One evening, as Rachel tucked Chloe into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Is Blake your boyfriend?" Chloe asked innocently. Rachel laughed, the question catching her off guard. "No, sweetheart, he's just a friend." Chloe frowned thoughtfully. "He's nice, and he makes you smile." Rachel froze, her daughter's words cutting through her like a blade. She hadn't realized how much Blake's presence had shifted the atmosphere of their lives. The next time Blake visited the McDonald's, Rachel met him with a guarded but genuine smile. "You're winning her over, you know," she said, handing him his coffee. Blake grinned. "Good. She's a great kid. You've done an amazing job with her, Rachel." Rachel looked down, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Thanks, but it hasn't been easy." "I can see that," Blake said, "and I want to help, if you'll let me." Rachel studied him for a long moment, her walls slowly but surely beginning to crack. She didn't know where this was going, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she didn't have to face everything alone. As Blake left the restaurant that day, Rachel watched him go, a small but growing sense of hope blooming in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. The crisp air of early December wrapped around Central Park like a gentle embrace, making it the perfect setting for an afternoon stroll. Rachel and Blake walked side by side, Chloe skipping ahead, her laughter ringing out as she chased after a flock of pigeons. Blake had planned the outing with care, choosing the park for its simplicity, a place where Rachel and Chloe could relax without the weight of pretense or expectation. Rachel wore a knitted scarf that Chloe had insisted on tying for her, its frayed edges a testament to the years it had weathered with them. She glanced at Blake, who carried a bag of breadcrumbs Chloe had abandoned in her excitement. His tailored coat and polished boots still spoke of his wealth, but his demeanor was warm, unassuming. He didn't look out of place in her world today. "You didn't have to come all the way out here, you know," Rachel said, tucking her hands into her coat pockets. Blake shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "I wanted to, spending time with you and Chloe. It's the highlight of my week." Rachel didn't respond immediately. She glanced at Chloe, who had crouched to inspect a squirrel darting across the path. There was a lightness in her daughter's laugh, an innocence that had been hard won. It was rare for Chloe to connect with someone as easily as she had with Blake. "You're good with her," Rachel said after a moment, her voice softer. Blake turned to her, his expression earnest. "She's amazing, and she gets that from you." Rachel's cheeks flushed, but she managed a smile. "I've just been trying to do my best. That's all any parent can do, right?" Blake stopped walking, causing Rachel to pause as well. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers. "You've done more than your best, Rachel. You've built a life for her, a home. That's no small thing." The sincerity in his voice made Rachel's chest tighten. Before she could reply, Chloe ran back to them, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Mommy, can we feed the ducks?" she asked, tugging on Rachel's hand. Rachel glanced at Blake, who smiled and handed Chloe the bag of breadcrumbs. "Lead the way, kiddo," he said. Chloe took off toward the pond, and Rachel followed, Blake walking beside her. The three of them spent the next hour feeding ducks, laughing as Chloe tried to imitate their quacks. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: peace. As the afternoon waned, Blake suggested they take a detour to a quieter part of the park. Chloe, worn out from her adventures, rode on Blake's shoulders, chattering happily about the animals she'd seen. Rachel watched them with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. They arrived at a small clearing where a park bench sat beneath a canopy of bare branches. Blake lowered Chloe to the ground, and she immediately began gathering sticks to build an imaginary duck house. Rachel sat on the bench, grateful for the rest. Blake joined her, his hands resting on his knees. For a moment, They sat in comfortable silence, watching Chloe play. "I've been thinking about something," Blake said suddenly, his voice low. Rachel glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Blake hesitated, his usual confidence tempered by a rare vulnerability. He turned to face her fully, taking a deep breath. "Rachel, meeting you and Chloe, it's changed my life. I've spent years chasing things that don't matter, filling my days with noise to drown out how empty everything felt. But then I met you, and suddenly, everything was different." Rachel's heart began to race, her mind struggling to keep up with the emotion in his voice. "Blake, were you?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The sight of it made Rachel's breath catch in her throat. "Rachel Miller," Blake said, his voice steady despite the intensity in his eyes. "I know we come from different worlds, and I know this might seem fast. But I also know that I don't want to spend another day without you and Chloe in my life. You've shown me what it means to live, to care about something real." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Rachel stared at him, her mind racing. Her first instinct was disbelief. How could someone like Blake Harrison, a man with every option in the world, want her? But as she looked into his eyes, she saw nothing but sincerity. "Blake," she began, her voice faltering. I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," Blake said, his lips curving into a soft smile. "Say we can figure this out together." Rachel's gaze flicked to Chloe, who had abandoned her sticks and was now watching them curiously. The thought of giving her daughter a stable, loving family tugged at her heart. But doubts lingered. "I don't want to be a charity case," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "I don't want you to feel like you have to save us." Blake reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "You're not a charity case, Rachel, and I'm not trying to save you. I want to be part of your life because I love who you are. You already saved me." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes, and she looked away, trying to gather her thoughts. After what felt like an eternity, she met his gaze again. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But we take this one step at a time, for Chloe's sake." Blake exhaled, relief flooding his features. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands steady despite the rush of emotions between them. Chloe ran over, her face alight with curiosity. "Mommy, what's going on?" Rachel knelt down and pulled her daughter into a hug. "Blake asked me to marry him," she said, her voice soft. Chloe's eyes widened. "Does that mean he's going to stay with us forever?" Rachel glanced at Blake, who smiled and knelt beside them. "If it's okay with you, Chloe, I'd like to stick around." Chloe grinned and threw her arms around Blake's neck. "You're funny. I like you." Blake laughed, hugging her back. Rachel watched them, her heart full and conflicted. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. The first morning Rachel and Chloe woke up in Blake's sprawling mansion felt like a scene from a movie. Everything around them was polished, orderly, and, to Rachel, overwhelmingly pristine. Chloe's room alone was larger than the living room and kitchen of their old apartment combined, outfitted with a canopy bed, a dollhouse bigger than any she'd ever seen, and a bookshelf filled with neatly arranged, brand-new books. Chloe's eyes sparkled as she took in every detail, running from corner to corner, but Rachel felt a pang of discomfort as she watched her daughter. This wasn't her world, and despite Blake's best intentions, she wasn't sure it ever would be. Blake was waiting downstairs, dressed in his usual impeccable attire, but his face lit up with a warmth that softened his polished exterior when he saw them. "Good morning, Rachel." "Chloe," he called out, spreading his arms to welcome them into the dining room, where a breakfast feast was laid out. Fresh fruit, golden croissants, an array of jams, and even a chef standing by, waiting to take any special requests. Rachel felt her stomach tighten as she took in the spread. At their old apartment, breakfast was usually a rushed bowl of cereal or scrambled eggs if they were lucky. She glanced at Chloe, who had climbed into a chair, her eyes wide with awe as she stared at the food. "Mommy, can I try the pancakes?" Chloe asked, her small hands hovering over a plate stacked with fluffy, perfectly golden pancakes. Rachel forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart." Blake watched Rachel carefully, sensing her discomfort. He reached out, placing a hand gently on hers. "If there's anything you'd like changed, anything at all, just let me know," he said quietly. "I want you both to feel at home here." Rachel looked at him, her expression softening. She knew he meant well, but this house, with its grand marble floors and expansive hallways, felt more like a museum than a home. She gave him a small nod, hoping he'd understand. As the days passed, the stark contrasts between their old life and their new one grew harder to ignore. Blake had arranged for a car service to take Chloe to school, but Rachel couldn't shake the memory of their daily bus rides, where Chloe would chatter away about her day, and Rachel could steal a few precious moments of time with her daughter. Now Chloe was whisked away in a sleek, black sedan, and though it was undeniably more comfortable, Rachel missed the simplicity of their old routine. At first, Rachel tried to adapt, accepting Blake's generous gestures. But it wasn't long before the whispers began. She noticed the skeptical glances from his friends, the murmured conversations at the lavish events he'd occasionally invited her to. She felt them judging her, the single mom who had seemingly caught a billionaire. One evening, as they returned from a charity gala, Rachel's unease boiled over. She walked into the mansion ahead of Blake, her shoulders tense as she removed her coat and hung it up. Blake closed the door behind them, watching her with concern. "Rachel," he began gently, "what's wrong?" She turned to face him, her expression weary. "Blake, tonight was difficult. I'm not used to people looking at me like that." Blake took a step toward her, his face creasing in concern. "What do you mean?" Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair. "The whispers, the stares, they think I'm here for your money. They think I'm just some gold digger who..." Her voice trailed off, frustration mingling with hurt in her eyes. "It's exhausting." Blake's jaw tightened, his hands clenching slightly. "Rachel, you don't owe anyone an explanation. They don't know you like I do, but they're your friends, Blake," Rachel said softly. "They're part of your world, and right now, I feel like an outsider in it." Blake crossed the room and took her hands in his gaze steady. "If they can't see what I see in you, then they're not really my friends." Rachel looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know how to fit into this life. It's so different from everything I've ever known." Blake wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "You don't have to fit into anything. I fell in love with you because of who you are, not because I wanted you to change." Rachel leaned into him, allowing herself to be held, though her mind remained restless. She wanted to believe him, to trust that their love was enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. But as the days wore on, the challenges continued to mount. One afternoon, Rachel received an unexpected call from her former neighbor, Sylvia. The familiar voice was a balm, grounding Rachel in a way she hadn't realized she'd missed. Sylvia, who had always been like a grandmother to Chloe, caught her up on neighborhood gossip, then asked how she was adjusting to her new life. "It's a lot, Sylvia," Rachel admitted, her voice wavering. "It's beautiful here, but it doesn't feel like home." Sylvia's laughter crackled through the line. "Homes aren't about walls or fancy things, sweetheart. They're about people. Just give it time." But time didn't seem to help. Rachel felt as though she was walking on eggshells in Blake's world, where every action, every word, seemed to invite scrutiny. She began spending more time with Chloe in the small, garden courtyard at the back of mansion, a quiet refuge that felt like their own little escape. Blake joined them when he could, and though he tried to ease Rachel's discomfort, she sensed his frustration growing as well. One evening, as Chloe drifted off to sleep, Rachel sat by her side, running a hand over her daughter's soft curls. She heard Blake's footsteps in the doorway, and he leaned against the frame, watching them with a gentle smile. "She's happy here," he said softly. "Isn't that what matters?" Rachel looked up at him, her heart torn. "She's resilient. She'll find a way to be happy anywhere. But will you?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Rachel swallowed, the weight of his question settling heavily on her. She didn't know how to answer. Days turned into weeks, and though Rachel tried to adjust, the tension between her and Blake became harder to ignore. One night, after a particularly grueling charity event, she voiced her concerns more openly than she ever had before. "Blake, I don't belong here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I feel like a guest in your life." Blake's face softened, and he reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You're not a guest, Rachel. This is your home." 2. Rachel shook her head, struggling to put her feelings into words. "It's hard to explain, but I feel like I've lost part of myself. I miss the simplicity, the routines Chloe and I shared." Blake took a deep breath, his expression filled with understanding. "Then let's bring some of that back. We don't have to live a life that doesn't feel right for us. Let's make our own version of home." For the first time, Rachel allowed herself to believe that they could find a balance. Maybe they could blend their lives, creating something uniquely theirs, a place where they both felt at home. It wouldn't be easy, but as she looked into Blake's eyes, she saw the commitment and love that had brought them together in the first place. They agreed to take small steps, limiting the overwhelming events, keeping weekends for quiet family time, and bringing more of Rachel's personal touches into the house. Bit by bit, Rachel began to feel that she and Chloe were not just visitors, but part of a family, building a new life together with Blake by their side. But as she drifted off to sleep that night, Rachel knew the road ahead would be far from smooth. They had taken the first step, but many challenges lay in wait. It was a path neither of them fully understood, but they would face it together, one day at a time. With each passing week, Rachel settled deeper into her life with Blake, but the whispers from his social circle grew harder to ignore. Her every move seemed to draw scrutiny from those around her, friends of Blake's, associates, and even the house staff who, though professional, cast the occasional judgmental glance her way. The knowledge of being watched, of constantly being measured against the unspoken expectations of Blake's world, began to wear on her. One afternoon, Rachel went to a boutique in Midtown, hoping to find something suitable for an upcoming charity gala Blake was expected to attend. The moment she stepped into the store, the polished assistant assessed her with a polite but critical gaze. She seemed to immediately recognize Rachel, her eyes flickering with barely concealed disdain. Rachel tried to brush it off, browsing the racks with a practiced indifference, but her confidence faltered when she overheard two well-dressed women whispering near the fitting rooms. "Did you hear about Blake Harrison's latest charity case?" One of them muttered with a smirk, her voice dripping with condescension. The other laughed quietly. "Oh, I did. Isn't she the one with the child? Can you imagine? I suppose Blake has finally decided to play the hero." Rachel felt a surge of anger mixed with humiliation, and her grip tightened on the dress she was holding. She left the store without buying anything, her mind racing as she navigated the bustling streets, struggling to shake off their cruel words. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Rachel's mood was somber. She barely heard Chloe chattering about her day at school, her thoughts tangled in frustration. She was only vaguely aware of Blake's arrival until he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Rachel," he said, his tone soft. "Is something wrong?" Rachel forced a smile, shaking her head. "No, it's nothing. Just a long day." Blake wasn't convinced. He guided her to sit down at the table, his expression filled with concern. "Tell me," he insisted gently. Reluctantly, Rachel recounted her experience at the boutique, her voice growing sharper as she described the women's words. "They think I'm some charity case you've taken in, that I don't belong in your world." She swallowed, her hands clenched in her lap. "And maybe they're right." Blake's expression darkened, a rare flicker of anger in his usually calm demeanor. "They don't know anything, Rachel. They have no right to judge you or assume anything about our life together. It's not just them, Blake. It's everywhere I go. People assume I'm after your money, or that I'm just the poor single mother you decided to help out of pity." She looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "It's exhausting, and I don't want Chloe growing up feeling like she doesn't belong either." Blake reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I understand, Rachel. More than you know." He paused, searching her face. "But you have to know that you belong with me. I chose you, not because of your background or your past, but because of who you are. Those people don't matter to me." Rachel's frustration simmered, mingling with an unexpected sadness. "But they're part of your life, Blake. And no matter what you say, I can't change the fact that I'm not like them. I didn't grow up with money or privilege. I don't know how to blend in with these people." Blake pulled her closer, his eyes steady. "Then don't blend in. You don't need to change, Rachel. If anything, maybe they need a little more of you in their lives." She couldn't help but smile at his words. But the pain lingered. Despite Blake's reassurances, the weight of the judgments around her grew harder to bear. The small family dinners she'd looked forward to with Chloe became overshadowed by the thought of others viewing her as an outsider in Blake's life. She kept her feelings to herself, not wanting to strain their relationship, but the constant undercurrent of judgment gnawed at her. At the gala that weekend, the whispers resumed. She stood beside Blake in a fitted dress, her head held high, but every polite smile and sideways glance left her feeling more alienated. The event was a grand affair held in a towering ballroom with chandeliers that cast shimmering light across the crowd. Guests mingled, champagne glasses in hand, their conversations flowing with an ease Rachel envied but could not emulate. A tall woman with perfectly coiffed hair approached them, her expression one of barely disguised curiosity. "Blake, darling, so good to see you," she purred, giving him a quick hug before turning her assessing gaze on Rachel. "And this must be your friend." Blake slipped his arm around Rachel's waist, smiling. "This is my fiancée, Rachel." The woman's eyes widened momentarily before she recovered, her smile icy. "Of course. I'd heard, but I thought it might be just a rumor." "Well, it's certainly lovely to meet you, Rachel." Rachel managed a polite nod, trying to ignore the condescension in the woman's tone. But the next few hours proved challenging as more people approached with similar reactions, their words laced with veiled skepticism or outright surprise. She knew they were wondering why Blake Harrison, a man of his wealth and influence, would choose someone so far removed from their world. As the evening wore on, Rachel grew more withdrawn, her confidence waning. Finally, after a particularly icy conversation, she excused herself, slipping away to a quieter corner of the room. Blake found her minutes later, concern etched across his face. "Rachel, are you okay?" She looked up at him, her voice tight with barely contained frustration. "Blake, I can't keep doing this. I feel like a guest in my own life. Like I don't belong, and everyone here knows it." Blake's gaze hardened, his expression fierce. "You belong with me, Rachel, and I won't let anyone make you feel otherwise." He took her hand and led her back into the main room, his head held high. As they rejoined the crowd, he drew her close, speaking loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting my fiancée, Rachel, she's one of the strongest, most incredible women I know. She's made me a better man, and I'm grateful every day that she chose to be part of my life." The room grew quiet as his words rang out, a mixture of surprise and discomfort on the faces around them. Rachel felt a rush of warmth, both from his public declaration and from the shocked stares of those who had doubted her. Blake's eyes softened as he looked down at her. "You're my partner, Rachel, and anyone who can't accept that doesn't belong in our lives." The warmth of his support soothed her frayed nerves, and she managed a small smile, nodding as she allowed herself to believe his words. For the first time that night, she felt a sense of belonging, not because of the grand setting or the luxury surrounding them, but because of the man standing beside her. As they left the gala, Blake's hands securely in hers, Rachel felt a new resolve take shape within her. She realized that her worth didn't depend on the approval of his world, and as long as she had Blake and Chloe by her side, she could find a way to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. Over the next few days, Blake's public display of loyalty had its intended effect. Word spread quickly through his circle, and the whispers began to die down. Though not everyone was convinced, Rachel found herself the recipient of polite smiles and even tentative conversations. The lingering judgment didn't disappear entirely, but with Blake's unwavering support, she felt stronger, more resilient. And as Rachel stood in her new life, she finally began to see the path forward. A path built not on the acceptance of others, but on the quiet strength that had carried her through so many challenges before. The winter sun streamed through the tall windows of the mansion's library, casting golden light across the polished wood floors. Rachel had always loved the quiet charm of the room, a refuge from the grandeur of the rest of the house. Chloe was at school, and Blake was out for a meeting, leaving Rachel with a rare moment of solitude. She was sifting through a box of papers Blake had left on the desk, mostly contracts and financial reports. He had asked her to help organize some older documents he was reviewing for an upcoming board meeting. As Rachel worked, her fingers brushed against an aged manila folder tucked beneath the pile. The tab was labeled simply, Camden Manufacturing Acquisition Records. Rachel froze. The name sent a chill down her spine. Camden Manufacturing. The factory had been the lifeblood of her hometown, employing hundreds of families, including her father, until it abruptly shut down nearly a decade ago. The closure had devastated the community, leaving many, including her own family, struggling to make ends meet. With trembling hands, Rachel opened the folder. Inside were spreadsheets, memos, and correspondence outlining Blake's company's role in the acquisition and subsequent closure of Camden Manufacturing. One memo in particular caught her eye. Recommend immediate shutdown of Camden facility to maximize profitability and streamline operations. Projected savings, $14.8 million annually. Rachel stared at the words, her vision blurring. Blake's signature was scrawled at the bottom of the approval form. The reality hit her like a punch to the gut. The man who had become her partner, the man she was building a life with, had played a direct role in the unraveling of her family's stability. Her hands shook as she closed the folder, her mind racing with anger, betrayal, and disbelief. She felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Memories of her father's heartbreak after losing his job, the long nights Rachel spent working extra shifts to keep their family afloat, all came rushing back with painful clarity. When Blake returned later that afternoon, Rachel was waiting for him in the living room, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. Her expression was unreadable, her voice steady but cold. "Blake," she said as he walked through the door. He smiled when he saw her, but his expression faltered at the look in her eyes. "Rachel, what's wrong?" She held up the folder. "I found this while organizing your documents." Blake's brows furrowed as he recognized it. "Oh, that's from an old acquisition. Why?" "Camden Manufacturing," Rachel interrupted, her voice sharp. "Do you even remember it?" Blake paused, clearly caught off guard by her tone. Yes, I remember. It was a tough decision, but at the time, it made sense for the company." Rachel's grip on the folder tightened. "It didn't just make sense, Blake. It destroyed lives. My father worked there. My entire town depended on that factory. And when it closed, everything fell apart." Blake's face paled, realization dawning in his eyes. "Rachel, I didn't know. You didn't care to know." She shot back, her voice rising. "All those numbers on your spreadsheets, those savings, they weren't just statistics, Blake. They were people's lives. My life." Blake took a step toward her, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Rachel, please. I didn't know about your connection to Camden. I swear if I had, would have mattered." Rachel interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "Would you have done anything differently?" Blake's silence was answer enough. Rachel turned away, tears welling in her eyes. "You talk about how much you've changed, about wanting to build a life with me and Chloe. But how can I trust that knowing what you've done?" Blake's voice was quiet, but heavy with regret. "Rachel, I was a different man then. I made decisions based on profits, on what I thought was best for the company. I didn't stop to think about the human cost. I'm not proud of it." She turned back to face him, her expression fierce. "Then what are you going to do about it now? Because words aren't enough, Blake. Not for me, not for Chloe, Blake nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. You're right. Words aren't enough. I'll fix this. Somehow, I'll make it right. Rachel shook her head, her voice breaking. You can't undo what's already been done. My father, he's gone now, Blake. He never got the chance to recover from what happened. No amount of money or apologies can bring him back. Blake stepped closer, his eyes pleading. I can't change the past, Rachel, but I can change what I do moving forward. Give me the chance to prove it to you. Rachel hesitated, her anger warring with the love she still felt for him. Finally, she spoke, her voice weary. I need time, Blake, to think, to figure out if I can even move past this. Blake nodded, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. Take all the time you need, but please, Rachel, don't give up on us. That night, Rachel lay awake, her thoughts a storm of emotions. She wanted to believe Blake's remorse was genuine, but the pain of her past was too raw to ignore. The man she loved had been complicit in the hardships that had shaped her life. Blake, meanwhile, sat in his study, staring at the documents Rachel had confronted him with. For the first time, he truly saw the consequences of his decisions, not as abstract figures, but as the pain and loss etched into Rachel's face. The next morning, he began making calls. He didn't know if his actions would be enough to mend the rift between them, but he was determined to try. Blake spent the next few days working tirelessly to make amends, throwing himself into actions that would show Rachel and himself that he was serious about change. His first step was reaching out to leaders in Camden, looking for ways to undo some of the damage his company's closure had caused years before. He knew he couldn't bring back the factory or restore the life her father had lost, but he hoped to find a way to give back to the community that had been a part of Rachel's life. Rachel watched Blake's efforts from a distance, her heart conflicted. She wanted to believe he could change, to see him as the man she had fallen in love with, not the one who had unknowingly played a role in her family's pain. But the wound was still fresh, and every conversation, every document he reviewed, felt like a painful reminder of the past she had tried so hard to leave behind. One evening, Blake returned home after a long day of meetings with local business leaders and community organizers. His face was drawn, a mixture of exhaustion and determination etched across his features. He found Rachel sitting in the courtyard, a book resting on her lap, but her gaze was distant, lost in thought. He hesitated before approaching her, unsure if his presence would be welcome. Rachel, he said softly, taking a tentative step toward her. She looked up, her expression unreadable. How did it go? Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's a start, but there's still a long way to go. I met with some local leaders. We're working on a plan to bring in new businesses, startup grants, job training. I want to help the people of Camden rebuild. On their terms, not mine. Rachel nodded, her gaze shifting back to the garden. I'm glad you're trying, Blake, but this doesn't erase what happened. Blake knelt down beside her, his eyes filled with regret. I know. I can't undo the past, Rachel, but I can choose a different future. I want that future to be with you. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of pain and hope. Blake, it's not just about what happened in Camden. It's about who you were when you made those choices, the kind of man who valued profits over people. How do I know that man isn't still part of you? Blake's shoulders slumped, her words striking a chord of truth he couldn't deny. He had been that man once. The man who believed in numbers and efficiency, who never looked back to see the impact of his decisions. But now, as he looked into Rachel's eyes, he knew he couldn't be that person anymore. You're right, Rachel, he said quietly. I was that man, and I'm ashamed of it. But meeting you, seeing the world through your eyes, it's changed me. You've made me want to be better. I just hope that someday you can see that. Rachel's expression softened, but she looked away, her voice barely a whisper. I want to believe you, Blake, but I need to see that you mean it. Actions speak louder than words. Blake nodded, his resolve strengthening. Then I'll show you, for as long as it takes. The following weeks were filled with small but meaningful actions on Blake's part. He organized a series of community meetings in Camden, inviting residents to voice their needs and concerns, and he arranged funding for a new vocational training center. He made a point to consult with community leaders on every decision, knowing that genuine change would only come if the town felt ownership over its future. Rachel began to see the effects of his efforts. Her old neighbors, friends she hadn't heard from in years, began reaching out to share their cautious optimism. The training center was set to open within the next few months, and several small businesses were already showing interest in hiring locally. Blake's commitment was real, and slowly, Rachel's heart began to soften. One afternoon, Blake invited Rachel to accompany him to Camden for one of the community meetings. She hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to face her past in such an intimate way. But as she watched him prepare, his face etched with both determination and a rare vulnerability, she found herself agreeing. The trip to Camden was quiet, both of them lost in thought. When they arrived, the town looked much the same as it had when she left. The streets were familiar, lined with modest houses and small storefronts. But there was a sense of renewal, a quiet hope that hadn't been there before. The community meeting was held in a modest hall, filled with residents of all ages. Blake stood at the front, addressing the crowd with a humility Rachel had never seen in him before. He listened intently as people voiced their hopes and concerns, promising that his role was to support them, not dictate their future. Rachel watched from the back of the room, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. She saw the way he connected with the people, how he took their questions to heart and addressed each concern with respect. It was a side of Blake she hadn't fully known, a man willing to put his pride aside for the sake of others. After the meeting, an elderly woman approached Rachel, her eyes crinkling with a warm smile. "You must be Rachel," she said, her voice soft but kind. "Blake's told us a lot about you. He's a lucky man to have someone like you by his side." Rachel blushed, surprised. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a flicker of pride she hadn't expected. The woman leaned in, her gaze thoughtful. "I know what happened here hurt a lot of people, but I can see that he's trying to make things right, and that wouldn't be happening if it weren't for you." As they left the meeting, Rachel found herself looking at Blake with renewed appreciation. The journey of rebuilding trust between them would be long, but she was beginning to believe that he was committed to change, not just for her, but for himself. That evening, as they drove back to the mansion, Rachel reached over and took Blake's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake glanced at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "For what?" "For showing me that you're serious. I'm proud of what you're doing." A smile broke across Blake's face, a mixture of relief and gratitude. "I'll keep proving it to you, Rachel, for as long as it takes." Rachel looked out the window, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. For the first time, she allowed herself to envision a future with Blake, a future built on trust, respect, and the kind of love that was willing to grow and change. As they pulled up to the mansion, the tension that had once weighed so heavily between them felt as though it had finally lifted. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Rachel felt ready to face it together. The week after their return from Camden, Rachel noticed a change in Chloe. At first, it was small things: a yawn too early in the evening, a reluctance to play after school. Chloe seemed tired, quieter than usual, her usual spark dimming. Rachel brushed it off as a simple case of school fatigue, but when Chloe developed a low-grade fever that lingered for days, her worry grew. One afternoon, as Rachel helped Chloe with her homework, she noticed her daughter's hand trembling slightly as she held her pencil. Chloe's face looked pale, and she winced, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Sweetheart," Rachel said, feeling a knot of worry tighten in her stomach, "are you feeling okay?" Chloe shook her head slowly, her voice faint. "My head hurts, Mommy. And my tummy too." Rachel immediately checked Chloe's forehead, feeling a warmth that seemed more than a mere fever. She quickly called for Blake, who was working in his study. He appeared in the doorway within seconds, worry already etched across his face. "What's wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside Rachel and Chloe. Her fever hasn't gone away, Rachel said, her voice tight with worry. And she says her head and stomach hurt. I think we need to take her to the hospital. Without another word, Blake wrapped Chloe in a blanket and gently lifted her into his arms. They rushed to the hospital, where the doctors examined Chloe, running a series of tests that stretched late into the night. Rachel paced anxiously in the waiting room, her heart pounding as she clutched Blake's hand, seeking comfort in his presence. They shared worried glances, neither daring to voice their fears. Finally, a doctor approached them, his face serious but calm. "Mr. Harrison, Ms. Miller," he said, his tone gentle. "We've run some tests on Chloe. She appears to have a rare autoimmune condition that's causing her immune system to overreact. It's treatable, but will require a course of medication and regular monitoring." Rachel felt her knees go weak as the doctor's words sank in. Blake wrapped an arm around her, his grip steady, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. Chloe's condition was serious, and the prospect of treatments and hospital visits loomed large in their minds. For the next several days, Chloe remained in the hospital as the doctors worked to stabilize her. Rachel stayed by her bedside, barely leaving the room except to grab a quick meal or take a few deep breaths in the hallway. Blake was there too, splitting his time between the hospital and his business, yet always returning with fresh flowers, small toys, or stories to brighten Chloe's spirits. One night, as Chloe slept, Rachel and Blake sat quietly in the dimly lit hospital room. Rachel stared at Chloe, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "I just want her to be okay," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Blake reached for her hand, his voice firm and reassuring. "She's a fighter, just like her mother. She'll get through this, Rachel. We'll make sure she does." Rachel looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you for being here. I don't know how I do this alone." Blake's face softened, and he leaned closer. "You're not alone, Rachel. Not now, not ever. I'm in this with you and Chloe, for whatever comes." The sincerity in his voice touched Rachel deeply, a reminder that despite the pain of the past weeks, Blake had been unwavering in his support. She knew now, more than ever, that his commitment was genuine. Over the next few weeks, Chloe's condition began to stabilize. The treatments were working, and her energy gradually returned, though she still tired easily. Blake took time away from his business to be there for her, often bringing his work to the house so he could stay close. He learned to read her favorite storybooks, color with her when she had the energy, and sit with her quietly when she needed rest. One afternoon, Chloe looked up at him with a curious expression. "Blake, do you like being here?" Blake laughed, surprised by the question. "Of course I do. You're one of my favorite people." Chloe smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "'Cause I like you too. You're like a hero, but without the cape." Blake's heart swelled, and he leaned over to give her a gentle hug. "Thank you, Chloe. That's the best compliment I've ever gotten." Rachel watched the exchange from the doorway, her heart full as she saw the way Blake cared for her daughter. He wasn't just there for Chloe. He was invested, a steady presence who had gone from being a stranger in their lives to someone they could rely on completely. That night, as Rachel tucked Chloe into bed, Chloe looked up at her with wide, sleepy eyes. "Mommy, do you think Blake will stay with us forever?" Rachel hesitated, stroking Chloe's hair gently. "I think so, sweetheart. I think he wants to." Chloe closed her eyes, her voice a soft murmur. "I hope so." When Rachel stepped out of Chloe's room, she found Blake waiting in the hallway. He had overheard Chloe's question and looked at Rachel with a mixture of warmth and tenderness. "She's right, you know," he said softly. "I'm here for the long haul, Rachel. I'm not going anywhere." Rachel felt her throat tighten, but she managed a small smile. "I believe you, Blake. I do." The days turned into weeks, and Chloe continued to improve under the watchful care of her doctors. Rachel and Blake fell into a routine, a partnership built on mutual care and understanding as they navigated the highs and lows of Chloe's condition together. They were a team, united not just by circumstance, but by the quiet, resilient love that had taken root between them. In the wake of Chloe's illness, Rachel's last doubts began to melt away. Blake had proven himself not only as a partner, but as a father figure, someone who loved Chloe with a depth and dedication that was clear in every gesture, every word. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Chloe chase fireflies in the yard, Rachel reached for Blake's hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "For everything. For being there for Chloe. For being there for me. I don't know if I ever really told you, but I love you, Blake." Blake looked at her, his face breaking into a smile that held both joy and relief. He pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I love you too, Rachel, more than anything." In that moment, Rachel knew that despite the challenges they had faced, they had built something real, something lasting. They had found their way through pain, through hardship, through doubt. And now, as Chloe laughed under the evening stars, their family felt complete, bound together not just by love, but by the resilience they had all found in each other. As Chloe's health stabilized and life returned to a steady rhythm, Blake found himself questioning his path more deeply than ever before. The corporate world he'd once thrived in now felt hollow. Every decision he'd made, the deals, the acquisitions, the endless drive for profit, hadn't brought in the fulfillment he'd found in the quiet moments spent with Rachel and Chloe. Watching Chloe recover, seeing Rachel's fierce love for her daughter, he realized that he wanted a life rooted in something far more meaningful than wealth. One morning, over coffee in the sunny corner of their kitchen, Blake looked across the table at Rachel, who was slicing fruit for Chloe's breakfast. She had always been his grounding force, a constant reminder of the life he wanted to build. "Rachel," he said quietly, setting his mug down, "there's something I need to talk to you about." She looked up, surprised by his tone. "Is everything okay?" Blake took a deep breath. "More than okay, actually. But I've been thinking about my work, my business, about what I want my life to look like. Our life." He paused, meeting her gaze. "I want to make a change. A big one." Rachel set the knife down, sensing the seriousness in his voice. "What kind of change?" "I've decided to sell off a large part of my business," he said, his voice steady. "Not just to reduce my responsibilities, but to focus on something that matters. I've realized I don't need all of this constant push for more. I have enough. What I want now is time. Time to be with you and Chloe, and to give back in a way that feels meaningful." Rachel's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and understanding in her gaze. "Blake, that's huge. Are you sure?" He nodded, a sense of peace in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "I'm more than sure. This decision has been a long time coming. I want to create something real. I want to use what I have to make a difference. Maybe even start some community programs or foundations that support single mothers and kids like Chloe." Rachel's hand flew to her mouth, emotion welling up as she took in the depth of his commitment. "Blake, I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied gently, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I've found my purpose here, with you and Chloe, and if I have the chance to use what I've built to do good, then that's what I want. I want to give back and build something that actually matters." A tear slipped down Rachel's cheek, and she squeezed his hand. "You've already changed so much, Blake. I never would have asked you to do this, but I'm so grateful." Blake smiled, a new sense of purpose shining in his eyes. "Thank you, Rachel. It's because of you that I even have the courage to make this decision." Within the next few weeks, Blake's announcement that he was divesting from several major companies sent waves through the business world. The media buzzed with speculation. Some praised his retirement, while others questioned his motives. Blake ignored the noise, focusing instead on the future he was building with Rachel and Chloe. As his workload lightened, he poured his time and resources into his new venture, the Harrison Foundation. Dedicated to supporting families, single parents, and educational opportunities for underserved communities, the foundation quickly became his passion. Rachel often joined him in planning programs, their shared vision deepening the bond between them. Blake's mansion underwent changes as well. The formal rooms he'd once used for business gatherings transformed into community spaces. The sprawling yard, once pristine and unused, now housed a community garden where neighbors, children, and volunteers could gather and learn to grow their own food. One afternoon, Rachel found Blake in the yard, his sleeves rolled up as he showed a group of local kids how to plant tomato seedlings. She watched from the porch, a soft smile on her face, as he knelt beside a little boy, patiently guiding him through the steps. It was a sight she hadn't dared to imagine just months ago. A man once consumed by wealth and status, now fully at ease, hands in the soil, laughing with children. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Blake joined Rachel on the porch, his face still flushed from the day's work. He took her hand in his, gazing out over the garden. "Thank you, Rachel," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "for everything. I never would have thought this life was possible if it weren't for you." Rachel leaned against his shoulder, a quiet contentment settling over her. "You've made this life possible, Blake. You chose it, and that's what makes it so special." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Chloe bounded up to them, clutching a small potted plant she had been given by one of the volunteers. "Look, Mommy." "Blake, I planted this today." Blake grinned, ruffling her hair. "That's wonderful, Chloe. What are you going to name it?" Chloe thought for a moment, her brow furrowing in concentration. "I think Mr. Sprout." They laughed, and Blake reached out to take her hand, drawing her close. Rachel watched them, her heart full as she realized just how far they'd come. In that moment, she saw the future they were building together. Not a life of wealth and status, but one of love, resilience, and a commitment to others. And as she looked into Blake's eyes, she knew that this was the life she had always dreamed of, finally brought to life. In the months following Blake's decision to step away from the corporate world, life settled into a rhythm Rachel could have only dreamed of. With each passing day, Blake's dedication to his family and his newfound purpose grew stronger. The Harrison Foundation thrived, with Rachel often by his side, helping to shape projects that reached the people and places that needed it most. Chloe had blossomed, too, her joyful laughter filling the home, her bond with Blake deepening with every shared story, every bedtime hug. But there was a weight in Rachel's heart that hadn't fully lifted, a quiet, lingering worry that somehow all of this could still be lost. Despite the transformation she'd seen in Blake, there were moments when the memories of past hardships and losses whispered that happiness could be fleeting. She'd been strong for so long, facing each struggle head-on, but now that she had found family, fear had slipped in beside her gratitude. One evening, as they prepared to celebrate the success of their most recent foundation project, a center for single parents that would open in Camden, Blake found her sitting alone on the porch. Rachel looked out over the yard, lost in thought, her expression distant. He approached quietly, sitting beside her and slipping his hand over hers. "You seem a million miles away," he said softly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Rachel gave him a small smile, but her gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "I'm sorry, Blake. I should be thrilled about the center, but I can't shake this feeling." She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. Like it could all disappear. Blake's face softened, and he turned to face her fully, his eyes filled with concern. "Rachel, nothing's going to disappear. This life we've built, it's real. I promise you, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." A tear slipped down Rachel's cheek as she looked at him, her voice breaking. "I've fought so hard for Chloe, for myself, and now that I finally have something good, I'm terrified of losing it, of losing you." Blake's heart ached at her words, and he reached out, cupping her face in his hands. "Rachel, I know what it's like to lose everything, even if it wasn't the same. You've been through so much, and you've carried more than anyone should. But you don't have to carry that fear alone anymore." He took a deep breath, his voice steady and sure. "I'll spend the rest of my life showing you that you're safe, that you're loved." Rachel placed her hand over his, her gaze meeting his, vulnerable but filled with trust. It's just hard to believe sometimes that someone like you could love someone like me." Blake's eyes softened, and he smiled, his voice tender. "Rachel, you've taught me more about life, about love, than anyone ever has. You are my world, you and Chloe. You're not someone like me or someone like you. We're just us. And I wouldn't trade this life for anything." They sat in silence for a moment, her head resting on his shoulder, both of them grounded in a peace that only honesty could bring. Rachel's fears hadn't entirely vanished, but they felt lighter, softened by the strength of the man beside her. She closed her eyes, letting herself believe in the future they were creating, a future where love, family, and resilience wove their lives together into something unbreakable. Blake held her close, whispering softly, "This is our life now, Rachel, and I'm never letting go." In that quiet promise, Rachel found the courage to let herself hope, to let herself truly, deeply, and wholeheartedly believe that this life, this love was real. As winter's chill began to ease, Blake proposed something unexpected yet deeply meaningful to Rachel. One evening, while they were sitting by the fireplace with Chloe asleep upstairs, he turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. "Rachel," he began, his voice tender, "I've been thinking about everything we've been through. All the moments, the struggles, the joy. It's been an incredible journey. I know we're already committed, but I'd like to celebrate what we have in a way that's truly ours. Would you marry me again?" Rachel's heart skipped a beat, her hand moving to her chest. "Blake, you mean renew our vows?" Blake nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, not as a grand display, but something simple. For us. For Chloe, too. A promise. One that reflects this life we're building together." Rachel's eyes softened, and tears welled up as she nodded. "I'd love that." The day of the vow renewal dawned bright and crisp, with only a small gathering of friends and family gathered in the backyard garden that had become so special to Rachel, Blake, and Chloe. Blake had worked tirelessly to transform it into a charming, intimate space, with strings of soft lights and arrangements of wildflowers, Rachel's favorites, carefully placed along a simple arch. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the quiet hum of nature. Chloe flitted excitedly around them, wearing a pale yellow dress that matched her bright spirit. She had taken her role as flower girl very seriously, and as guests took their seats, she carefully tossed petals along the grassy path leading to the arch. Blake watched her, his heart full, and then his eyes moved to Rachel, who stood at the edge of the garden, looking radiant in a simple, cream-colored dress. When Rachel took her first steps toward him, Blake felt the world around him grow still. He'd seen her every day for the past year, but today, she looked like a vision. She walked with grace, her gaze fixed on him, her love and trust evident in her every step. As Rachel reached him, Blake took her hands in his, gazing deeply into her eyes. The ceremony was quiet, with only their closest loved ones there to witness. There was no opulent backdrop, no flash of cameras, just them, standing together under the morning sky, reaffirming the promises that had already shaped their lives. Blake cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke. "Rachel, when I first met you, I thought I knew what I wanted, but you taught me what really matters. You've shown me kindness, strength, and a love I never knew existed. Today, I promise to honor you, to support you, and to walk beside you every step of the way. You and Chloe are my heart, and I will cherish you both, now and forever." A tear slipped down Rachel's cheek as she smiled, her voice soft but steady. "Blake, you entered our lives when I had given up hope of finding someone who could see us, really see us, for who we are. You showed me that love can be patient and generous. You taught me that I'm not alone, that I don't have to carry everything on my own. Today, I promise to love you, to trust you, and to believe in the life we're building together. You're my family, and my heart is yours." As they exchanged simple gold bands, a symbol of their recommitment, Chloe dashed forward to stand between them, her small hands reaching for theirs. Blake and Rachel laughed, each taking one of her hands, and in that moment, they felt complete, grounded in a love that was theirs alone. The rest of the day was a simple, joyful celebration with the closest of friends, filled with laughter, home-cooked food, and memories shared under the open sky. Rachel and Blake spent the afternoon sitting in the garden with Chloe nestled between them, watching her delight as she picked flowers and listened to stories. In the quiet moments that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel and Blake sat on the porch, their hands intertwined. They watched Chloe chasing fireflies in the twilight, her laughter echoing softly through the garden. Rachel leaned her head on Blake's shoulder, sighing contentedly. "I didn't think I'd ever have this," she whispered. Blake pressed a gentle kiss to her hair. "You deserve all this, Rachel, and so much more. I'm grateful every day that I get to share this life with you." They watched Chloe until the stars appeared, filling the sky with their soft light. And in that serene moment, Rachel knew this was the life she had always dreamed of, the family she had never thought she'd find, and a future filled with the simple, quiet beauty of shared love. A few months after the vow renewal, life felt beautifully complete for Rachel and Blake. Chloe was thriving, her health steady, and the days seemed to flow with the ease of a dream finally realized. Rachel had settled into the life they were building with Blake, her heart feeling fuller than it had ever been. Then, one morning, Rachel began feeling unusually tired. She dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the bustle of managing both her roles at the foundation and as a mother. But as the days passed, the fatigue lingered, joined by waves of nausea that made her mornings especially difficult. Blake noticed her pale face over breakfast one day and frowned with concern. "Rachel, are you okay? You've been looking, well, tired," he said gently, studying her face. "Maybe you should see the doctor." Rachel offered him a reassuring smile. "I'm sure it's nothing. Probably just the change of seasons." She tried to dismiss his concern, but the next day, the dizziness and nausea had only intensified. Finally, she decided to make an appointment. The doctor listened to her symptoms, a thoughtful smile crossing her face. "Rachel," she said, her tone gentle, "I think we might want to do a quick test." Moments later, the doctor returned with a beaming smile. "Congratulations, Rachel. You're pregnant." Rachel's heart raced as the words sank in. Pregnant, a new life growing inside her, a sibling for Chloe, and a child with the man she loved. Overwhelmed with emotion, she thanked the doctor and hurried home, her mind buzzing with excitement and disbelief. As she entered the house, she found Blake in the kitchen, busy arranging lunch. He turned to her, his expression lighting up with a warm smile. "Hey, how did it go?" Rachel could barely contain herself. She walked over, taking his hands in hers, her face glowing. "Blake, we're having a baby." Blake stared at her, the news taking a moment to sink in. When it did, his eyes filled with wonder, and he broke into a broad, joyful smile. "Rachel, are you serious? We're having a baby." Rachel nodded, laughing through her happy tears as he pulled her into a tight embrace. Blake's hand moved gently to her stomach, his touch filled with awe and tenderness. "This is incredible," he whispered. "I never thought I'd have this. Another chance to build a family, to raise a child with you." Tears shimmered in Rachel's eyes as she looked up at him. "I feel the same way. It feels like a miracle, a blessing I never expected." As they held each other in the kitchen, a small voice interrupted them. "Mommy, what's going on?" They turned to find Chloe standing in the doorway, watching them curiously. Blake knelt down, pulling her into his arms with a grin. "Chloe, guess what? You're going to be a big sister." Chloe's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and excitement flashing across her face. "Really? I'm going to have a baby brother or sister." Rachel knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Yes, sweetheart, you're going to be the best big sister ever." Chloe's face broke into a smile, and she threw her arms around both of them, giggling with joy. "I can't wait. I'll help take care of them and play with them every day." As they sat together on the floor, holding each other in a shared embrace, Rachel felt the last remnants of her worries melt away. She knew now that this was her family, the life she had always hoped for but never thought possible. In the months that followed, Rachel and Blake prepared for the arrival of their new child, filling their home with love and anticipation. Friends and family gathered to celebrate, and Chloe took her role as future big sister seriously, practicing with dolls and reading picture books to Rachel's growing belly. One quiet evening, as they sat together on the porch under a sky full of stars, Blake took Rachel's hand in his voice filled with quiet awe. "Rachel, I never thought I'd be this lucky. You, Chloe, and this little one. We're family now, and there's nothing I could ask for more." Rachel leaned against him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It took us a long road to get here, but I wouldn't change a thing. This is exactly where we're meant to be." As they sat together, dreaming of the life they would build, Rachel knew that this family, the one she had created with Blake and Chloe, was the true wealth she had searched for her entire life. They were finally complete, bound together by love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family.